satirist and everything. I let him tell you more, but he is truly a gem. And I love seeing the people that come from the countries that have suffered through the communism and then come here and go, well, it's happening here too, because they end up being the greatest patriots and the best Americans of all. So, nice to see you, Oleg.
That was a great introduction. Thank you very much. I had a great warm-up act from Governor Perry, so that's also nice. Now, almost a century ago, in 1919, an American left-wing writer, Lincoln Steffens, visited Soviet Russia, and he wrote his famous quote, "I have seen the future and it works." A century later, I feel like paraphrasing that, I have seen the future and ran away. Run away I did, but that future is catching up with me now, and although this time it's not coming from Moscow, it's coming from Washington, D.C. And the slogan of the current administration may as well be, "A century of failure proves nothing." Some Americans are already running away from this future, and it's cheaper for them to move their estate overseas than to deal with the IRS. Well, I don't have that problem. I don't have an estate to move. And besides, I think America is the best country. There's nowhere for me to go from here. So this is it for me, and I'm taking the final stand here. Now, coming to America 20 years ago was like making a jump in time. I had boarded a Soviet plane in Moscow, and that was in the past. And then I landed many years ahead in a wonderful future. It was like a science fiction movie. America was a very different place, and all this material abundance and all these technological advancements that made life easier and more pleasant. And when I bought a newspaper, I didn't need to read between the lines to know what really happens. And most importantly, people here lived with a lot more dignity. They were not slaves to their government. So the relationships between people were also more honest. People of different income treated each other as equals. That wasn't the case in my old country, where we had more or less equal income, but we were not equals. There was a wall of separation between the people and the elites. Then there were also differences between people who lived in Moscow and the rest of the country. And for the rest, our social status also depended on who was closer to the government trough. Because when the government enforces economic equality, then money doesn't matter as much. And what determines your social status is your access to the distribution system. So it's a whole different mentality, and a whole different civilization, a whole different planet. And so I was glad I finally landed on this American planet. But I also had a few disappointments. I was disappointed to see that many Americans took their country for granted. So I made a point never to forget the difference, and never to take America for granted, and I never have. The American way of life, that's what real human progress means to this immigrant. And I was also so disappointed that many people were eager to destroy it. Why they wanted to destroy it? Because they didn't like that different people had different level of income. Those people weren't poor. They had more money than me, but other people made even more money. And they just couldn't live with that, and the envy was eating them alive. And so the weirdest thing was that these people called themselves progressives. So I figured that they had hijacked the word progress and made it mean going 100 years back to the old failed collectivist system that kills human dignity, stifles innovation, spreads poverty, and pits people against each other. But that is not progressive, that is regressive, any way you look at it. And it's going back in time to the era of peasants and overlords. And that is the system that I ran away from in my time machine. So when Obama says forward, that actually means backwards according to my compass. And you see, I have this old-fashioned compass that points to absolute standards. And not many people have this compass anymore. And that's why the progressives were able to switch directions and change America's course backwards. So I'm feeling like a time traveler again. And given the direction this country is heading now, I may well be a comrade from your future. I recognize all the signs. You know, there's an old Soviet joke that sums up the workers' paradise in one line. They pretend that they're paying us, and we pretend that we're working. And when free speech is restricted, it is getting replaced with underground political jokes. And if a Republican doesn't win in 2016, then we may as well start recycling old Soviet political jokes. Well, but the good news is I know many of them. Hundreds. I've written serious essays in the American Thinker, in PJ Media, and Front Page Magazine, and I published a serious book, but I still believe that one single good joke can have a bigger impact than 10 serious essays. And I also believe that political jokes play their role in the downfall of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet system. And that is why I'm running this satirical website, The People's Cube. Because I believe that I am making an impact. Now, what is The People's Cube? Oh, okay. You already told that it's the politically correct Rubik's Cube. Now, it's gloriously red on all sides. All squares are equal, and all players are equal, and nobody is too smart, and nobody is too slow. And it gives you guaranteed equality of results. A symbol of fairness and painless existence, approved by the Teachers' Union. A model for progressive education reform. No more failing grades. And it is colorblind friendly. And it comes with an operating manual. So, nobody's a boob with the People's Cube. The inventor of the original Rubik's Cube, Ernie Rubik, is a Hungarian. So he knows exactly what I'm talking about. And at one point, an online store gave me a problem saying that I don't have the right to sell these cubes without Rubik's permission. So I contacted Ernie Rubik in Hungary, in Budapest, and he loved the joke. So he gave me permission to use his brand and asked me to send him a couple. And that's what I did, and now he owns the People's Cube. Now, the Cube is not all what the website is about. It's basically like a magazine of spoof news, and it's kind of making a parody of the left. We're exposing absurdity of the left by taking their own language to the extreme. And we write under the slogan, we cure weak liberalism with strong communism. So it's like a Stalinist Politburo. And Rush Limbaugh on his show called The People's Cube the Stalinist version of The Onion. We have contributors from all over the States and even some other countries. Now, sometimes, you see, well, life has a nasty habit of imitating satire. And so life imitates the People's Cube all the time, and sometimes the stories that we write about become true, unfortunately. And sometimes also people it gets so close to the reality that people think it's true and start forwarding our stories to others. Just recently, Snopes.com debunked 2 of our stories in a row. One was about Rosie O'Donnell making a tattoo of the ISIS flag on her behind to protest American imperialism. And another one was about Michelle Obama taking down the portrait of Lincoln and other American presidents to replace them with the pictures of Obama's dogs. So they were debunked as not true. All right. So sometimes parodies do become real news, though. And one thing I discovered when I first came to America is that not all Soviet jokes worked in translation. And the problem was not even the language, it was the fact that many Americans had no life experience of totalitarianism. They did not know the absence of freedom of speech and how people feel about that. And that was in the early 90s, after 8 years of Reagan's administration and then 4 years of Bush Sr., and it was just the beginning of the Clinton era. So, of course, Americans were not yet familiar with all this government dictate and brainwashing and limits on free speech and shameless propaganda in the media. Well, now they do. Yeah. And so all Soviet jokes are becoming a lot more translatable. I know. Here's one of my favorites, and it deals with the discrepancy between the official narrative and the reality. It's called The 6 Contradictions of Socialism in the USSR. And it goes like this. It's a bulletin list. So, there is no unemployment, and yet no one is working. No one is working, and yet the factory quotas are fulfilled. The factory quotas are fulfilled, and yet the stores have nothing to sell. The stores have nothing to sell, and yet people have everything at home. The black market. Then people have everything at home, and yet no one is happy. No one is happy, and yet the voting is unanimous. Now let's see how this old Soviet joke can be remade into a new American joke. Let's call it The 6 Contradictions of Socialism in the United States. America is capitalist and greedy, and yet half of the population is subsidized. Half of the population is subsidized, and yet they think they're victims. They think they're victims, and yet their representatives run the government. Their representatives run the government, and yet the poor keep getting poorer. The poor keep getting poorer, and yet they have things that people in other countries only dream about. They have things that people in other countries can only dream about, and yet they want America to be more like those other countries. See, you're laughing, but that's bad. That's bad that you're laughing, because that means you know what this joke is about. And I'd rather nobody knew what it's about, and I hope the future generations won't. Am I being too optimistic? Oh. So, how exactly is the USA becoming more like the USSR? And it's not a joking matter. Here are just a few signs that I noticed upon my arrival. The first troubling sign was the existence of New York. I'm kidding. Of course, at first I settled in New York, and at first I didn't notice any difference. Well, I'm kidding, yes. There was a difference, but, you know, the further I moved away from New York, the more I was beginning to feel like I live in America. But then, the closer I was getting to New York, the more I was feeling like back in the USSR. And so I figured it had to be some kind of a decompression chamber for immigrants from the Soviet Union, so that they would feel better. Now, today, Mayor de Blasio is in charge, so it must be even more so. And so I'm not going back to New York. I like living in America. Now, the first radio station I discovered was National Public Radio, and with its local affiliate WNYC. It sounded very much like Soviet radio. It was long, boring, condescending, pseudo-spiritual, pseudo-intellectual, detached from reality, and funded by taxpayers. And Like Soviet radio, it had no commercials, but a lot of propaganda. So I figured it had to be some kind of a transitional project for Soviet immigrants too. Another thing, I realized that whoever pays controls the content, and that I'd rather suffer through commercials on the Rush Limbaugh show. You know, at least he doesn't take his talking points from 1-800-Flowers. Now, another disturbing sign that I was just about every critically acclaimed book or movie was exposing the evils of capitalism. All the villains were rich business people, U.S. military, or the CIA. And all of the heroes were the leftist activists or anti-corporate outcasts, ACLU lawyers, or victims of American foreign policies. And in other words, building or defending this country was somehow criminal. I couldn't understand why America's creativity was so one-sided, because when I worked in New York, in New York corporations, that was, they were full of these bohemian-looking people who were working as temps and spent their days writing novels and screenplays on the work computers. And those novels and plays were all about evil corporations, a menace to mankind. And that wasn't their first-hand experience. It was just some Marxist cliches that they were regurgitating. And at some point I told them that, you know, you're biting the hand that's feeding you. And they stopped liking me after that. Now, that's just another set of contradictions. You know, without capitalism, there would be no Hollywood. And yet filmmakers hate capitalism. And yet they sue for unauthorized copying of their movies. And yet on screen they teach us to share. And yet they keep all their millions to themselves. And yet they tell the world stories about America's poverty and depravity. And yet they blame the resulting anti-Americanism on conservatives. And yet conservatism ensures the continuation of a system that makes Hollywood possible. See if these things just write themselves. Another sign of creeping socialism is the language of crisis, struggle, and sacrifice. Now, in the USSR, we lived in perpetual crisis. Everything was a war, a struggle, a battle for wheat, or a war for productivity. And there were also lots of heroes. Heroes of war, heroes of labor. And they fought for production quotas. They struggled against weather. They sacrificed themselves and others for the bright future. And have you noticed that American politicians no longer merely do their jobs? They struggle, they fight, they sacrifice. Present company excluded, of course. Because Rick Perry did talk about a sacrifice, but that was about the military. And it's a completely different thing, because the military do live in a situation of crisis, and they do sacrifice. But what the progressives do is they bring the language of sacrifice and fight and war and crisis into the civilian existence. And that is what is wrong with this picture. Obama's biggest talent is turning every nuisance into a crisis. It's like he has a paper cut, and it's a paper cut crisis. That's it, I'm raising taxes. Except when it is a real crisis, like the southern border, then it's just a nuisance. So with every new crisis, we sacrifice more things, and we sacrifice our money, comfort, jobs, opportunities, health insurance, liberties, and this isn't like a tax return. They're not giving it back to you after April 15th. I mean, the government never sacrifices back. That's it. It just takes. So have you ever thought who exactly is on the other end of your sacrifice? Is there somebody who collects and tags and files all those sacrifices that you... No, they disappear into this gigantic black hole. Well, not at first. At first, on the receiving end of every sacrifice made by a U.S. citizen, there is a government bureaucrat taking credit and getting a raise. And then it all gets sucked into a gigantic black hole. So, now let's see. How much more? Laurie? Do I have a little more time? Or no? All right. Now, let's see. I know an old lady who prays God, asking God every day to open Obama's eyes on what's going on. But I think Obama already knows. He's at the top of that pyramid that sucks up everything. And he wants more sacrifice, not less, because, it's a crisis. And Soviet citizens sacrificed all the time until there was nothing left to sacrifice, and then the country just fell apart. And now they're trying to do the same thing here in the United States. Now, another disturbing sign that I saw was that the mainstream media like to count other people's money. And not in a good way, as if getting richer is somehow problematic. They didn't tell stories about great ingenuity, talent, hard work that bring people great fortunes. No, they were talking about how unfair it is that some people have more income than others. Now, they finally decided to cap the salaries of people in the private sector, where salaries actually are supposed to be determined by free market. And that's basically the consequence of the class envy. The envious people are the ones who are running the show. So, for the left, sacrificing America is a small price to pay for the mirage of economic equality. History shows that no price is too high, even human lives. They start always with the property, then they sacrifice the owners of the property, then it will be a whole class of people, then an ethnic group, or a whole country, and there is no end. And there is no end because economic equality is unattainable. It's a phantom concocted in the feverish minds of these maniacs who are obsessed with class envy. Now, we all have different incomes, so what? Is it worth killing for it? No. Only a deranged maniac would do such a thing. So I say let's instead sacrifice the idea of economic equality. And it is a very small price to pay for remaining a free, productive, and moral people in harmony with human nature. And thank you.